Hello and welcome to the 6th edition of the AviaDev Insight Africa Connectivity Update for 2025. Bring a deep dive into the route developments to, from, and within the sub-Saharan African market. I'm your host, Jon Howell, the CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. We are a platform dedicated to supporting fleet and route developments to and from and within sub-Saharan Africa. We're back after an incredible AviaDev Africa in Zanzibar earlier this month. We had a record attendance and we're excited to cover some of the route announcements that hopefully over the next few months are going to be a result of some of the meetings that took place at the event, which was over 1,200 meetings delivered over a couple of days and some really interesting conversations. We've got a lot to get through today, but today for the intros, as I always do, to try and jazz it up, I thought I would channel somebody who has a checkered aviation history in the African market, and that is Sir Richard Branson. Yes, so this is the chap who once thought he could conquer the African skies with Virgin Nigeria. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite go to plan. That's a whole other story. Great ambition, but he ran out of runway, as we say in the industry. While Virgin Nigeria may have been grounded, the dream of a connected, thriving African aviation sector is anything but, and that is exactly what we're going to be covering today. So joining me today are two industry powerhouses who don't just talk about aviation, they live it. So first of all, let me introduce somebody who could probably recite every aircraft timetable from memory while simultaneously solving Africa's connectivity puzzle. That is Behramjee Ghadially. Behramjee's not just an aviation consultant, he's the kind of numbers wizard and route mastermind you want in your corner when you're trying to make sense of where the next billion-dollar opportunity might take off. He'll tell you how to spend all your money, maybe keep some of it. We'll see. I've met a fair few experts in my time, but Behramjee is the real deal. Somebody with a sharp mind who blends cold data with a burning passion for making aviation work, especially in the places that matter most, namely Africa. Fantastic. Welcome, Behramjee. So here we go. Get ready. This is a man who knows which routes will soar, which should never leave the tarmac. Here's somebody I wish I'd had on speed dial back in the days of Virgin Nigeria. Maybe things would have gone a little bit differently if Jon Mendis had been in the cockpit next to me. Jon is what I'd call a proper aviation maverick, the kind who doesn't just sit in the boardroom theorizing. He's been in the trenches, from running airlines to managing ground ops in some of the most dynamic and frankly unpredictable markets on the planet. East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, the Middle East, you name it. He's probably launched a route there, fixed a crisis, or built an airline from the ground up with duct tape and pure determination. He's got the kind of hands-on, sleeves rolled up experience that somebody like Sir Richard admires, the sort of guy who knows how to get an aircraft in the air and make it profitable. Two very different skills that I learned very much the hard way. Today, Jon is a go-to aviation consultant with a knack for cutting through the noise and telling it like it is. And trust me, in African aviation, you want somebody who tells it like it is. If Virgin Nigeria taught me anything, it's that you can't just slap a logo on a plane and expect magic. You need people like Jon and Behramjee, people who know how to navigate complexity, bureaucracy, and the occasional runway goat. Today, you're in for a treat. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Thank you. Great to be here as always.
Fantastic. Is that your Richard Branson impression? Very good. So just as we kick off, as always, I have to put in the disclaimer, the opinions of my guests are, of course, their own, do not necessarily reflect the views of AviaDev.
Particularly mine. Particularly Jon. But mine are very much my own. Not linked to AviaDev in any way.
Absolutely. So stand down, legal team. We're all good. We've done our all protocol observed. We can move on now. So that's good. Let's kick off with a really big subject, which is the impact of a certain travel ban from the US, the Trump travel ban, as it's being called, and the impact this is having on African airlines. We alluded to it in the last episode that we would come back and actually look at this when we had a bit more data. We still don't have everything, but of course, it's a fascinating multi-layered issue that I think could also be beneficial for Africa as well. It could yield some new opportunities. But I think in terms of what it means for the African airlines outbound, Jon's got some details on that. So you're going to kick us off and talk us through those changes, Jon. Over to you.
Okay, since we're going to talk about the President of the United States, let me go ahead and put on my Make Airlines Great Again hat. We'll make them great again. That's great. But Africa, that's a different story. Can't trust Africa on these things. But yes, let's get into a bit more serious stuff on this. By the way, if you do want hats, drop me a note in the comments for this, and I'll get a whole bunch made up and send them out to people I like who request them. But anyway,
Are you hawking
as
your
we know,
merchandise on my podcast?
I just happened to just mention it over there. I'm also wearing an AviaDev hoodie. I'm doing all the logos today. And in fact, under this, I've got an AviaDev running shirt. So, hey, I've got all the logos today. But
Good
okay,
man.
Africa travel bans. So at this point of time, we have seen an initial list of countries that the US has placed some travel restrictions on. Now, the way these travel restrictions are structured, they don't necessarily have an immediate impact because current visa holders are still permitted to travel, but they are not issuing any new visas or renewals for people from these countries to the United States until there is a successful resolution. Beyond that, there are further 30-odd African countries who are on watch lists where they potentially might be singled out for travel restrictions depending on actions they take or do not take over the next few months. And I think because of that, there has definitely been some uncertainty from African carriers. In fact, we know there has been uncertainty from African carriers speaking to them in terms of how they're going to deploy their capacity to North America over the current summer season and over the months beyond that. Just looking at three of the major African carriers flying into North America right now, we've seen Kenya Airways has reduced their frequencies to JFK. They originally had up to 10 weekly frequencies loaded. Those are down now mostly to 7. In fact, in many cases, down to 5 times a week. So a reduction of 50% of the originally planned capacity. And keeping in mind that a lot of Kenya Airways' traffic is from the Horn of Africa, where a big chunk of that travel restriction is going to apply to the Somalia market and so forth. So I think they're being a little more cautious in terms of not over deploying capacity, especially when they are having a significant shortage of wide-body aircraft anyway. Given a choice of deploying a wide-body on a route where you're going to fill it, and especially with that London Gatwick route opening up this week as well, I think in reducing their JFK frequencies. Egypt Air has not reduced frequencies, but they've downgraded aircraft where they were previously flying or scheduling 777-300 ERs on all their flights to JFK. They have now downgraded some of those to 787s. So that's a reduction in the number of seats on board, even though it may be a slight upgrade in the product which is being offered. But that again shows that they are expecting or seeing a softening of advanced booking demand to North America from Africa and vice versa. Ethiopian, of course, is the largest player in the North America market. And it's been actually interesting to see what Ethiopian did, because initially we saw that Ethiopian reduced frequencies in a lot of their North American markets relative to what they'd done in previous years. Chicago used to run daily in summer peak. Atlanta used to go up to 4 and 5 times a week and so forth. A lot of these reduced on frequencies. But what we've now seen actually is that they seem to be rolling some of that back. Looking at filings, we've seen that they've actually put in an increase of gauge for summer peak on some of these routes. For example, their Addis to Lomé to Washington route on some days, rather than being a 787-8, which is a 200 and a bit seater aircraft, they're putting in their largest 777-300 ER aircraft, which is nearly 400 seats onto that route. They're definitely seeing that maybe demand hasn't softened as much as they had expected to. Importantly, though, one thing which we had discussed before and had been widely, I won't even say rumored, but had been widely expected, was that Ethiopian would launch a new route to Minneapolis, St. Paul. From sources within the airline, we'd even seen schedules, launch dates, everything else that was to be expected from that route. However, they chose for a number of reasons. We expected the main reason would be because of these travel restrictions and the source markets for MSP. But we had a very interesting chance to sit down with the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines, Mesfin, during the AviaDev conference in Zanzibar. And one of the questions I asked him during a 1-hour bus ride to the wonderful reception, which was hosted by Puma Energy at the Seacliff Resort. I was sitting between Mesfin and Girma, so I really had a chance to get a lot of ET gossip then. But the interesting thing over there was that it seems that one of the major drivers for ET in being reluctant to launch Minneapolis was that they felt that Minneapolis might cannibalize the Chicago traffic a lot. It seems that Minneapolis is the largest source market for connecting traffic behind the Chicago gateway. So they actually were of the opinion that in a potentially softening market, starting Minneapolis in addition to Chicago would wind up taking what is one profitable route and one uncertain route into two unprofitable routes. And that was just not a risk they were willing to take given the shortage of wide-body aircraft and their ability to deploy wide-body capacity elsewhere in the network instead. So I think the reality is we've probably seen Porto is a new route that they've started with a 7-8. You've seen an increase in Manchester services, although that's a 350. You've seen Hanoi on a 7-8. And I think that is probably the capacity that would have probably been deployed to Minneapolis now being redeployed through the network as a result of this. But very interestingly, and here's just an interesting point which came out from this, and again, it's something we've seen mentioned in the media in the past. We've seen a lot of high-profile visits from this particular airport and municipal delegations on it. Plus, they've actually been active participants in the past at AviaDev, and that is Denver. And I was very surprised. I've always laughed it off saying, why would Ethiopian go to Denver? But from conversation with Mesfin, it seems that Denver is actually under very serious considerations from ET. Now, they do have challenges. Obviously, the altitude in Denver means you can't go nonstop between Denver and and Addis Ababa. The flight time mean that they would wind up having to park an aircraft overnight in Denver, so probably around 14 to 16 hours on ground with a double drop, whether that's via Lomé or via Rome or whatever else. But they believe that the feed that they can get from the Western and Midwest United States via Denver, especially with a favorable schedule relative to the Chicago or Washington departures, which right now are, for the most part, morning departures from there in order to hit the banks. But with Denver being further west, they may have a bit more flexibility in terms of improving that feed. So it's interesting. I was a bit surprised to hear that. But then the more you think about the reasoning he gave, as well as what we know, Denver has been aggressively pursuing an African connection, and ET in particular, I would not be surprised to see, not 2025 for sure, but potentially maybe summer 26 if the market warms up again, or whatever else. But I think Denver is right up there with Minneapolis as ET's potential next U.S. gateway. And if that U.S. market winds up remaining flat or growing slightly, despite these travel restrictions, I wouldn't be surprised to seeing that happen.
Yeah, fascinating. It's great what you can get from a bus ride, and you sat next to the CEO and the former CEO, and I'm sure they're thinking, oh, great, I've got Sean next to me. Although Mesfin was great. He loved talking about business, and as he said, Ethiopian is his life. So I'm sure he was quite happy to chat to you.
And what's actually great is the fact that we know that Ato Girma in particular is an avid listener of the podcast. Hello, Ato Girma, and a belated happy birthday to you. His 82nd birthday last week. I'm sure you're going to be listening to this soon, so here's another happy birthday wish for you.
Absolutely. And now we're hoping that the Trump team isn't checking your social media after that impression of him earlier. Because you might not be.
You know what?
That might be the end of that.
It is the best impression, the greatest impression, because he's the best president, and this is the best continent, and we're the best podcast.
Behramjee, do you want to come in? We've been chatting for nearly 15 minutes. You've not said a word yet. Tell us your thoughts on this and anything that Sean hasn't covered.
Yes, I didn't want to interrupt, Sean. It's not good. With regards to the US travel ban, yes, it has created a lot of uncertainty and uneasiness amongst not only ET, but also Turkish Airlines, Egypt Air, as well as some of the Middle East carriers who get a lot of transit traffic through their hubs through Eastern Africa in particular. Royal and Morocco will also feel the pinch eventually. But regards to what Sean said regarding Kenya Airways reducing JFK, there's one more aspect to it is because of a couple of 787s being grounded at KQ. So they don't have enough wide-body aircraft serviceable for the summer season as well. That also plays a key part into it. Secondly, with regards to Ethiopian Airlines and their ambition for Denver, let's look at Denver to Africa to begin with. The biggest market from Denver to Africa is Johannesburg, which is only 11,000 passengers, whilst number 2 is Addis with 9,000 passengers. So yes, if they do launch Denver, majority of the flight would be connecting beyond Denver to western part of the United States. However, as we all know, long-haul flights do not make money with beyond transit connecting packs destination. I would rather see ET launch Houston instead of Denver because the market for Africa for Houston is much bigger much more higher yielding, and they would still, I would say, lose money on a net profit basis flying to Houston via Rome, but it would lose much less versus Denver, because at least Houston, they will get much more J-class traffic for sure. I don't know if it's going to be
But Behramjee, I don't see Houston via
okay.
Rome. If they're going to do Houston, the Houston market is to
Yes,
Nigeria and
yes,
West Africa, so that would have to go via
yes,
Lome
but
again.
that means then they will have to do that long overnight layover in Houston. And if they do that, and if they can afford to do,
That's the
if they can afford to do that like they want to do with Denver, as you were saying, then Houston is a much better bet than Denver. Much better return on investment.
I agree with you, and this is something Mesfin had said as well. I think Houston, they've tried and failed multiple times before, and I think maybe that's why he didn't quite mention it as being high on their list. But I cannot. There was a solid business case for Houston. It was more of a scheduling case that went awry. They've tried Los Angeles from Lome. They've
Yeah.
tried all sorts of stuff from Lome in the past, all of which didn't work out primarily due to scheduling. So I think when they're in a position, and remember, they are taking 3 more A350s this year, 2 900s from the Sichuan Airlines NTU order plus one 1000 of their own. So I think July, August, and September are the 3 new wide bodies coming in, which will again free up capacity, which will give them the ability to potentially use a 7-8 3 times a week. That's one aircraft to deploy on some of these experimental North American routes. But given the overall situation with the US Africa market and the uncertainty, I don't quite see them trying it, not for a winter start for sure, maybe summer 26
Yes,
at best.
and
Yeah, I was going to say the only other variable here is what's the airport wants. They've come to AviaDev, as you say. They want Ethiopian. What are they putting on the table to incentivize ET
I'm
to
sure
start?
it's very, I'm sure it is very generous because Denver Airport has historically been known to offer very strong marketing support
yeah,
budgets to international carriers to come in there. And you know what? They've made it into at least more of an international gateway than it was 20 odd years ago. 20 odd years ago, I think they had flights to Mexico. Now they have trans-Pacific, transatlantic, and potentially a flight even to Africa now. So more kudos to them. It's a good example of how a focused marketing team with a decent budget is able to deliver
yes,
results.
but
Yeah, well
Sean, one
done,
thing
team.
though,
Yes, bro.
if they do fly via Lome, the problem is Lome Lagos on ASky is always nearly 90% or sold out. That's why I said via Rome, because they're doing Atlanta via Rome, and it's more or less the same type of traffic. West Africa passengers backtracking via Addis to from Atlanta, to and from Atlanta. So the Houston passenger would have to do that as well.
But see, the catch with Rome is they don't have the traffic rights via Rome. Rome is
No, no, I
purely
know,
a
I know, I
technical
know.
stop. So if they're going to have to do a two-way stop, which they need to do via there, it may be an altogether different point in Europe, whoever essentially is giving them traffic rights. So it may wind up that way. There's a lot of options there. As I said, it was a bit of a wild card to me when Mesfin mentioned it, and time will tell. I think Mesfin may be regretting opening up this speculation by mentioning it, but hey-ho, it is a reality. It's not as though this is the first time it's been mentioned. It's been covered heavily in the media by Denver Airport, by Denver municipality themselves. Yeah, let's see what transpires on it. But I think it was just an interesting thing for them to explain why Minneapolis did not make the cut this year for a variety of reasons, but also why they think that Denver is pretty much an equivalent to Minneapolis in terms of potential as a destination. Not as in O&D itself, but in terms of the very strong network that United in particular, the Star Alliance partner, is able to provide in terms of feed over there.
Last word on this,
So,
Behramjee, or are you
yeah,
good?
no, I have two things to say. Just one suggestion for ET. If they do consider flying Fifth Freedom via Europe to Houston, I would suggest it be routed via Brussels for two main reasons. Number one, it's a major Star Alliance hub. SN Brussels might be keen to code-share as well as United on the Brussels-Houston part. They would feed into the SN European network, but also SN would get access to Houston via ET indirectly. That could feed their West African market as well. Another option for ET for Houston could be via Manchester, taking over what Singapore Airlines left behind, as there is already a Manchester Singapore point-to-point market base. Or also another thing which is very interesting is that because of the Lagos increased frequencies at night, so even if the Houston Europe Addis flight arrives into Addis at night, like the other flights to via Lome, it will still feed into Lagos and Accra and South Africa as well as East Africa. So there won't be a problem getting feed whatsoever because hub-based banks are now more or less materializing nicely. And lastly, regarding Egypt on reducing JFK capacity, I'm not surprised because they also are flying to Newark. So they must have overestimated the potential of the New York market by adding Newark. So in order to balance out the right capacity, plus to have the same aircraft type flying to both Newark and JFK, it was more or less, I would say, a good operational decision to have so that the crews can rotate accordingly. That's my take on the matter.
Yep.
Okay. At the risk of just adding even more to this topic, I'm just going to say that running via Europe to anywhere in the US on a double stop basis would just screw up their their hub banks completely. Remember, the European banks coming into Addis are night departures from Europe, which would mean daytime transatlantics and generally a complete mess in terms of their current hub structure. I don't see that happening. I think, as you pointed out, the night arrival into Addis with a focus on an East African bank and the overnight Africa connections as well as India, Far East and stuff like that is more likely to happen, and that would mean via Lome. So yes, Houston via Lome I think is probably going to be what they do, but Denver is a wild card over here, and Denver via Lome is effectively the same as Houston via Lome. If they're going to push for something like that, let's see what happens.
Perfect. Okay, let's leave that one there. And we're going to touch back on this as well, because I did allude to it that there is some potential upside for non-African airlines that are thinking about deploying some of the capacity that's softening to the US and bringing that into the African market as well, which I think is definitely something that we're going to discuss later on. But while we're here in East Africa, we're going to go to Kenya and we're going to talk about Kenya Airways. So this was always in the agenda today, but we received some information. We're recording on the 1st of July. We got a picture and we've got some information on a partnership with Qatar Airways. And this could be in line with the ambitious Project Kifaru. Kifaru means rhino in Swahili, by the way, just if you didn't know that. I'm sure you guys did, but for our listeners. And part of that project was to have a strategic investor by 2026. So I think the interesting thing here is we were going to talk about the fleet plan and everything else. What KQ need is they need money and they need aircraft. What is this partnership? How does it fit into the wider strategy? It's very early days, but yeah, let's start with this one. So do you want to go first on this one, Behramjee? Tell us your thoughts.
This announcement came about this morning only, so we don't have any extra details or any detailed information regarding what the codeshare cities are beyond Doha or beyond Mombasa. We just know that it's a codeshare arrangement between Mombasa and Doha, flown by Kenya Airways but marketed by Qatar Airways. That's just step one. Obviously, there seems to be something much more bigger cooking up backstage. But from what I can make out from this, which I hope would happen, is that Qatar Airways might be willing or might be exploring the potential of exploring a stake in Kenya Airways in the near future. And if that is the case, being that Kenya Airways is now net profitable, they should look at what the Air India Indian government did with the Tatas, whereby taking over, the Kenyan government should absorb most of the debt, because otherwise it's not an attractive proposition for a new investor coming in, because it's not the new investor's fault that the airline has a legacy debt. And if that is the case, then it will be very attractive for Qatar, because Nairobi's geographical location is as good as Addis Ababa into getting into all the major cities in Africa. Kenya Airways is a much more stable airline, much more well-known airline in Africa versus Rwanda Air. Rwanda Air, unfortunately, has never made money its entire lifetime, nor does it expect to. Kenya Airways does have much more bigger potential for Qatar Airways. So if Qatar Airways wanted to look at this commercially and in a business-like mindset, they should just stick to investing in the new Kigali airport and not in Rwanda Air, and refocus their planned investment in Rwanda Air redirected to Kenya Airways instead. In terms of fleet and network, Kenya Airways flies 787, which Qatar Airways also does. Qatar Airways cancelled their 737 MAX order, but Kenya Airways flies 737. So that would not correlate. But Qatar Airways does have a huge 787 order backlog in the pipeline, already announced. So Kenya Airways does indeed need more wide-body aircraft to open up routes like Washington and Beijing, etc., in the near future. In fact, their CEO announced that they're looking to start Beijing flights next year. That we will discuss in detail at another time, not right now. So yes, the potential for a huge QR KQ partnership does have good potential. It seems to be, according to some people, a reply to the Ethiopian Etihad partnership, which I think has much lower potential than you think because of the Etihad's weakness in Africa. Qatar Airways is already well known in Africa. The Etihad is not. So that's where the big advantage comes into play. Plus, also Qatar Airways has a much bigger Asian network to feed Africa versus Etihad. That's another advantage that Qatar Airways brings to the table. Now, will that mean that Qatar Airways might in the future lobby KQ to move out from SkyTeam to OneWorld? The 50-50 guess. OneWorld does have some very interesting opportunities for KQ, especially with British Airways out of London and American Airlines out of JFK. But that's just us assuming things, but we don't know that for sure. But yes, the potential is good in the long run if they want to explore what I've just suggested over here.
Yeah, I think we've talked about Qatar quite a bit about what they did in Africa. They were very much awake and thinking about it and putting the stakes in. And then, of course, they've got a stake now in Airlink as well, 25%. So how do you see this, Sean, based on what Behramjee said and what you've read and spoken, people you've spoken to?
I think it's an interesting one. I don't actually see the benefit for Kenya Airways in doing this deal quite yet. That's not to say there isn't one, but from the information we have, or even the speculation we can have, unless Qatar is coming in with a significant investment, and chances are if they were going to announce a partnership like this, there would be some mention of an investment as well. As a very wise person says, sometimes you must be careful not to confuse activity for progress. And I think that may be something we are falling into over here. KQ has to be seen to doing something, and they're doing something for sure. Is that something going to come back and bite them? Are they conceding a market to Qatar that Qatar already has a share of, and they're just giving them better terms and access into that market? I'm not convinced. As Behramjee mentioned, you mentioned, John, KQ needs aircraft. In fact, from what they have said, they're looking at adding back 3 777-300 ERs. One is going to be one of their own aircraft currently leased to Turkish, but 2 others, which could be some of their former aircraft, which they may bring back, or it could be just from the market. We haven't heard any confirmation from them. They're looking at reducing. In fact, they've already started reducing their Embraer 190 fleet and adding 737s, and have stated that they're looking at 737 Maxes as well. They've got an interesting fleet transition. They've got a post-profitability come to Jesus moment where it's like, all right, now they've been focused for so long on just getting over this hump back into the black that now they've got to figure out, what do we do now? Because now you've got to grow, now you've got to maintain, and getting there may have actually been the easier part for them. Yeah, I don't have a position yet, but I think my position so far, based on what we know, is this may be Qatar getting the much better end of a deal than KQ is, based on what we can see and the information available today. Now, to go into what Behramjee said in terms of the Ethiopian Etihad side, I think as far as that goes, it's very different, because over here, Qatar is likely going to be the winner more than KQ, unless, of course, Qatar is bringing in a significant strategic investment into it, in which case it's a whole different story. But in terms of a pure commercial partnership, I think ET has gone into the deal with Etihad, and we've now seen ET's launching their flights to Abu Dhabi on the 15th of July, and we've seen over the last few weeks the destinations that ET is going to co-share to beyond Abu Dhabi. And the list is actually interesting. It's Colombo, Islamabad, Lahore, Maldives, Melbourne, Sydney, Phnom Penh, Phuket, and Krabi. So it's a very interesting set of destinations, but for the most part, it's all points east of Abu Dhabi, so there's no backtracking. It's not like they're looking at Eastern Europe, Middle East, or whatever. It's all secondary destinations that either ET cannot reach themselves with current fleet, like Melbourne, Sydney, or markets where they've got an interest, but maybe not quite enough traffic to justify non-stop yet with the MAX, such as Colombo, Islamabad, Lahore, Maldives, etc. So building up their market presence through the code share and so forth might give them the ability to start entering those markets in due course over the next couple of years as more and more MAXs get delivered to ET, which they took another MAX last week on delivery as well. So I think ET definitely has a strategy. In contrast, when you look at Etihad's code shares on ET, it's basically everywhere. If they've got a bilateral between UAE from there with traffic rights available, Etihad's going to put a code on the ET flight out there. I flew from Accra last week, and there was an Etihad code on the flight into Addis, even though there was no onward connection to either Abu Dhabi on either Etihad or Ethiopian onward. But hey, they had a code, so why not? And I think that's where I think it really sums up that Ethiopian went into this with a clear strategic direction and intention of what they wanted out of that partnership with Etihad, while Etihad was just see Africa, do Africa, and throw whatever we can at it. And just a little bit add on to this over there, and again, going back to my chat with Mesfin, Ethiopian is opening 2 UAE destinations this summer. One is Abu Dhabi, which launched on the 15th of July, and one is Sharjah, which launched a few weeks ago. And we'd had this discussion on the podcast when they announced, in fact, when they were first announcing it, I actually said I would not be surprised to see Sharjah announced during the summer, and sure enough, they announced Sharjah. But talking to Mesfin, he actually says that Sharjah has already exceeded their expectations. If you recall, I said I would not be surprised to see Sharjah going daily on a MAX or upgraded to a 787 by the end of summer. And when I asked Mesfin that, he said he would not be surprised to see it either. I think the frequency might be a challenge because of slots and so forth, but I think we might see up gauges of that during the peak. And I think we definitely would see ET looking at growing their Sharjah into at least a daily service and potentially even maybe off a third bank or the morning bank as a supplement to their 3 daily Dubai services, plus their now coming Abu Dhabi services. But in general, the overall message I got, and very strong message from ET, both from Mesfin as well as other people within there, is that Sharjah is outperforming Abu Dhabi in advanced sales by, it's not even close. Yeah. I think ET's Abu Dhabi is going to be a feeder into these new markets as an experiment, but ET Sharjah is O&D traffic, and that O&D traffic is a gold mine that they really should have looked at some years before now. But, it's something that they've been waiting for, and now the keys to the promised land have been delivered.
Yeah, great. I'm glad that we covered that because we've talked about it, and obviously you hearing that firsthand goes to show why they've done it and why we were so confident as well in terms of why it would work. And I think the wider point here about partnerships is they're not always 50-50. Sometimes you go into partnership with a stronger partner and they have more to gain than you do, and that is the deal. And I think sometimes we get that wrong when it comes to other things in the industry and in the continent, like visa reciprocity. And we're not going to get into that, but sometimes you have more to gain from the tourists than others, and some partnerships are more equitable than others. And that was a George Orwell thing.
A very important thing. And sometimes there are organizations which have more strategic focus, like Ethiopian, than others like Etihad, which seem to generally have dartboard will throw dart kind of philosophy in terms of network planning. We've heard stories about how their new route to Charlotte, North Carolina came about, even to the surprise of the airport authorities in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm fairly confident that knowing some of the people in Etihad who are driving this function and knowing the people at Ethiopian who drive this function, I know which one of those two teams I would put my money behind to be successful any day of the week. So I won't name names, but I think regular listeners to this show will know very much which side I would think I would back to be able to take benefit of that partnership more than the other.
Yeah, maybe we've got a new hat for you. Some airlines are more equal than others. Maybe that could be your next one from George Orwell's Animal Farm. Also, there we go. Bit of literature
one
for
last
you.
Thing. Qatar Airways, from what I'm seeing on Sabre, they're not flying to Mombasa presently. I'm not seeing any flights loaded for September. Let me check in December, because what I feel is that they used to fly to Mombasa before, I recall. So they'll probably be making KQ fly the flight, and they'll just buy the capacity of the plane itself, like what they're doing with Indigo.
And it's probably going to be, and I think that's probably I think that route is one where KQ will benefit, just simply on the fact that it'll bring in tourists from the Qatar Airways network into Mombasa. And this is something that which they tried to do from Dubai, but with the competition
No,
from Fly Dubai is double daily now, isn't it? Or at least in some days.
but seasonal,
They
seasonal
just
only.
simply KQ 738 simply could not compete there. I think KQ 738 with the QR code on it feeding into the wider QR network, that's Mombasa, Zanzibar, the mid-East African coast is booming right now for European tourism. And I think this is a strong way for KQ to get a piece of the pie as QR to expand their network into that. Using KQ's metal for it. And I think the 738 will probably be what
Yeah, of
KQ
course.
uses, similar to what they did for their Dubai
Yeah,
operation before. It's not a big hassle to operate that there. So yeah, I think that route makes sense in terms of cooperation. But obviously, they're not going to have Alan Kilavuka go all the way to Doha and sit in
no,
front
no,
of cabin crew and signage and everything else to sign a big agreement to announce the code share on
right.
one route. So there's more to this. We'll see what it is in due course.
Point is
Exactly.
very
We'll
small.
keep
It's only
doing
about 10,000 passengers Mombasa Doha.
No, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
point
of
to
course.
point. It's not point to point. You don't go point to Doha unless you're flying from India. That is, India and Middle East is the only things that Doha supports
Right,
point to point with. Everything else is about beyond traffic and the power
right.
of the hub.
Yeah, amazing. I seem to remember there being a lot of conjecture around the Qatar getting traffic rights into Mombasa, and there was a few years ago there was big problems with this. I seem to remember it being off and on and different things happening. And I want a big shout out to Qatar as well. And from the African side, I saw the amazing video of the aircraft doing the flyover at the Springboks game against the Barbarians in Cape Town. That was amazing. So yeah, I saw that on Hendrik's social media, and he sent it to me as well. Kudos to them for the support they're showing.
And don't forget Airlink. I
breaking it
mean,
up.
while all the TV cameras picked up the Qatar 777, there was an Airlink E190, in fact, the black one, which flew in front of it, just 3 minutes ahead of it. But Super Sport, I know in Malawi, Super Sport just missed that and just showed us the QR plane. Shout out to the Airlink guys as well for doing their part in a double flyby.
100%, and that was where I was going next. So yeah, good for them. And Paris Air Show happened between us last speaking and today, and it was just the week after AviaDev in Zanzibar, and we want to focus on a massive order there for Africa, which in particular was Airlink themselves, and you say that beautiful black E190 that they've got. The Airlink placed an order to lease 10 brand new E195 E2s from Azora. The deliveries are going to start end of September 2025. And I know this is something very dear to the heart of many of our listeners, because we've had a few sales directors that have been sat in a boardroom with Roger Foster and the Airlink management team talking about the E2 for many years. And so their work and their groundwork has been laid, and we've got a change at the helm at Airlink. We've got investment from Qatar. Is it that's changed this, or is it simply a fact that, and we'll get on to some of the routes they've applied for, they're in expansion mode and they need the aircraft and all the rest of it? Like, what's driving this, I think, is the question.
I think it's a combination of everything. The stars have now aligned. The time is right. We've seen a recovery now to almost pre-COVID levels in the South African market. Airlink is now beginning to see competition on a lot of its routes where it didn't actually see that before. For example, Zimbabwe, which is now fully open skies with South Africa, and where you're seeing a growth by Safair's capacity and so forth, and a drop in yields over there. So Airlink has to look wider afield to continue their growth. And as you mentioned, the precursor to this, which really made this not as much a surprise to those of us who enjoy looking at the South African Staatscourant National Gazette filings every month when they come out. Just a week before the Paris Air Show and a day before AviaDev started, the National Gazette in South Africa published that Airlink had applied for traffic rights between Cape Town and Lagos, Cape Town and Accra, Johannesburg and Mauritius, and Johannesburg and Zanzibar, which are four very interesting routes that their existing fleet would have struggled to serve in a non-stop basis, but which are pieces of cake for the brand new E195 E2s. So I did ask the Airlink team a few times. I asked the Qatar Airways, Hendrik, as well, is there something you want to share with us? And they were all like, you'll find out. And sure enough, the following week, we did find out. But I think the E2 is the logical next step for this. And as you've mentioned, the Embraer team has spent the last 3+ years trying desperately to put this into to put these planes into Airlink, and I think this is There was never a more logical aircraft order, and there was never a more wise way of doing it, because Azora has the delivery slots. They needed commitments for these aircraft. It's just a very good match from all sides. Embraer, Airlink, Azora, all the parties just fit together into a perfect jigsaw, and the routes are right there and waiting. Cape Town to Lagos remains Cape Town's number one unserved. No, Brussels is actually larger than Cape Town, Lagos, and that was temporarily served and went off it there. But for those who are actually interested in what these routes are out there, have a look at the two excellent reports which were outdoored at AviaDev. There's Geert's report for Airbus, which covers mainly intercontinental routes to and from Africa, and then there's Theo and Renato, which did the excellent intra-African regional route report for Embraer on underserved and unserved routes within the continent. And genuinely, I think he from South African Airways put it best when he says that these reports have become the African network planners' Bible. The insight, the numbers, the information you get from there, I know is fantastic. And the guys who write them sweat 12 months of the year for that 30-minute presentation at AviaDev. And believe me, it was the highlight of a lot of people's conference to see them actually presenting this live. And a shout out to Geert, who I know is a regular listener over here and has become a bit of a rock star. All the ladies coming up to him to take his autograph and post pictures with him. And I expect that we'll have Theo becoming just as much as one next year once the Embraer report gets its own loyal fan club like the Airbus report has. Yeah, I think this was something that pieces fit together. Great to see. Absolutely no doubt from my side that is going to be very successful when it does launch.
Yeah, great. And the numbers on these routes then, Behramjee, and your thoughts on this, the Cape Town, Lagos, and all the other routes that they've applied for, they all make sense to you think?
I think Sean, so a key sentence that Sean said summed it up very nicely. Never has there been a more logical order for aircraft in Africa. The E2, E95 for Airlink was a natural progression into their long-term strategy, regionally and domestically. They needed the extra seats that the E95, E2 can provide, especially on the domestic trunk routes of South Africa, Joburg, Cape Town, and Joburg, Durban in particular, to compete properly against Safair and a couple of other silly airlines in South Africa. Because I think Airlink is the most professionally run airline in South Africa. Second, I would say South African Airways. The others are just Mickey Mouse type. Whatever.
Really, really, you put SA above Safair.
That goes that next secondment, Behramjee. Sorry about that, my friend.
Yeah.
I'm friends with both the management teams, but I think even SA might take exception to being put above Safair in that respect. But anyway, let's continue with your view.
He's definitely getting bolder with his statement.
I think that's the most controversial statement of this podcast so far.
Safair are making the same mistake as Canada's Flair Airline as the Lynx by having the 738 as their smallest aircraft, because a lot of routes in domestic South Africa cannot support a 738, and that, as well as some regional routes.
The difference, though, Behramjee, is that Safair has 60% of the market in South Africa, while Flair and these other guys have been rounding errors. And when you have the market dominance, which Safair used as their strategy in the post-COVID time, when there was a market vacuum, they doubled down on growing capacity at the risk of having to do that capacity growth, which they knew would be eventually finite. So I think certainly they are in a bit of a corner, similar to what Airlink was. Airlink had too small a gauge, Safair had too large a gauge. But all else being equal, Safair has largely been well-funded, run, and has had a strategy and understood the shortcomings of that strategy. SAA has been a bankrupt company 4 years ago who is just now beginning to actually develop what they think is a bit of a coherent strategy. Even that, I will say the jury is a bit out on some of their routes, like splitting Sao Paulo to Johannesburg and Cape Town and stuff like that. I'm not quite sure that I would put South African Airways as better run than Safair. I'd say South African Airways is better run than a lot of people expected they would be at this stage of time. But Safair, there's a reason this is the market leader in South Africa, and this is a very highly respected airline. From my side, I have certainly strategically, I see where they're in a corner, but from what they've done and executed so far, they have been extremely well run.
Yeah, they're also the next guest on the AviaDev Insight Africa podcast this week. So maybe I should put that to
profitable?
them. Where do you rank yourself?
Huh?
That is a question which I don't think we're ever going to get an answer to, because what they claim and what others claim about them, and because of the way their financial structures are through the ASL group and so forth, it's a bit of a how long's a piece of string question. At the end of the day, though, I don't think their goal in the short term was that. And you know what? People will say, oh, but I'm a fan of profitability. I'm a fan of profitability when it comes to taxpayer money. If a private sector wants to go out and burn money, hey, let's just all gather around the fire and toast some marshmallows.
That's a nice quote. I like it. All right,
let's original question.
Yeah,
with regards to the route that the E2 could fly and open up for Airlink, Cape Town, Lagos, it's 6 hours, 20 minutes flying time, so right on the border's edge for the E2, E95. 45,000 passengers point to point, which can be stimulated easily with a direct service 3 times or 4 times a week. Cape Town to Accra, let me see that. Cape Town to Accra. 1 second. That's quite a small market. I don't see Airlink flying that. That's only 8,000 passengers per year. So that would be a much bigger risk. Lagos, I would say, is a no-brainer for them. Mauritius is also a very high-demand destination for South Africans, both from Cape Town and Joburg. So those flights should not be a problem filling up. There's one thing interesting about Mauritius, which many of our listeners would not know of, as to why South Africans love Mauritius when they already have beaches of world-class quality in Cape Town itself. It's because the water of Cape Town is not warm in the beaches. So that is why South Africans love to go to Mauritius and are now going to Zanzibar, because the waters are quite warm over there. I did not know that until I visited Cape Town and I spoke to a couple of restaurants in Camps Bay, the owners of those restaurants, and I asked them, okay, why aren't people swimming right now? And he explained to me the Atlantic and Indian Ocean waters, how the seasonality varies and it's not as warm as it should be, etc., etc.
And it's
I think a lot of people don't realize how cold Southern Africa gets at this time of year. I'm sitting in Malawi wearing a hoodie, and in the middle of the afternoon, it's 12 degrees outside. So, hey, it does get cold down here, and it's even colder when you go further south.
Yeah, I was there 2 weeks ago, and yeah, it was cold. But I think as well, Behramjee, it's also that the currents, the waves, it can be beautiful on a calm day, but you get that almost every day in Zanzibar, and you definitely don't get that every day.
We have a lot of...
And when it rains in Cape Town, it's wet and miserable. When it rains in Zanzibar, it cools things down, and 10 minutes later, it's dry again.
And also, you have a lot of private wealth of South Africans parked in Mauritius, especially those living in Johannesburg.
Sure. There's a lot of history over there, and I think Mauritius is where we have seen South African carriers have increased service. SAFAir has started Mauritius service themselves. We know other South African carriers are interested in it. South African Airways has flown double daily over the northern winter season, southern summer peak. So definitely South Africa to Mauritius is there. That's a market Airlink has struggled to compete in because they did not have the gauge. But remember, Airlink's bread and butter is not just O&D from Johannesburg like South African Airways and so forth. Airlink has such a humongous network of 50-ish destinations from Johannesburg, everywhere from Malawi to Namibia to Victoria Falls to secondary airports in South Africa and so forth, that Airlink's, it's not quite Ethiopian level, but they have a humongous hub which can feed into Mauritius and Zanzibar. And I think Zanzibar in particular is a bit of a dark horse over here, because Zanzibar can actually be pure utility flying like they fly Dar es Salaam. So again, fly those E2s between Joburg and Cape Town all day, and then one E2 at the end of the route flies to Lagos, Cape Town, Lagos, and the other E2 at the end of the route flies Johannesburg, Zanzibar, and back, and you get your utility in the 16-hour-a-day range with that, and great long segments and untapped market. So I think these are, as I said, the most logical order from an African airline that I've seen in a long time, and it's just I can't see it going wrong.
Just to add on that, in the Embraer report, there's an amazing slide, an amazing page all about the hub connectivity. So that we asked the guys to look at this. Airlink is averaging 2.2 frequencies per destination,
per day.
Ethiopian 1.9. Now, obviously, it's a different gauge massively. I think Airlink's is 48 and Ethiopia's 120, 130, something like that. Maybe actually, no, it's nearly 150, I think. But you can see that in the report, but it's so interesting because they are this hub and spoke. They are really delivering into those regions, and they serve so many destinations, but they're able to do that because, as Roger's always told us, they've got this not a one-size-fits-all strategy like the SAF uniformity, but they have uniformity when it comes to the manufacturer. Embraer have got this huge smorgasbord of different aircraft. And then you have an airline, and another airline that's really interesting is Astral, because Astral has all these different OEMs, but all these different sizes of cargo aircraft. They just jumped into my head because I think their strategy is somewhere not in the middle, but it's really interesting that what they've said is we need a different tool for a different job. We don't care. We'll have a real variety and everything else. So I think really have a read of that report because that element of it is really fascinating about how you build connectivity through a hub and how you use a hub to drive that. Yes, Behramjee, go on.
And just for the record, both Behramjee and myself are actually quoted by Embraer in that report.
Oh, indeed.
We have close ties to that. And John is quoted in the Embraer Global press release about the report. So hey, John is at a different level than us. We're just the worker bees here. He's the grandmaster of the show.
No, your quote, both of your quotes, very powerful. Anyway, about what is it? You said you can fly a small plane twice. You can't fly a half empty large
half of a large plane. Yeah. We can fly it half empty. You just can't cut it in half and fly.
Can't fly half of it. Can't chop it in half. Sorry, I butchered it. I chopped your quote in half. I'm sorry about that. My apologies. Behramjee,
Behramjee, what's your quote?
I don't remember it was a long sentence.
I see it was really insightful.
Yeah. But I wanted to say regarding the Airlink Mauritius thing, another reason why I think they're interested in Mauritius is due to Qatar Airways back channeling it because Qatar Airways cannot get into Mauritius by hook or crook. So for them to get into the Mauritius way through the side door is basically to get passengers to fly via Joburg with Airlink through baggage check-in.
Possibly. And here's an interesting point. In the Staatscourant, the same National Gazette filing where they applied, they also applied for Airlink to be granted traffic rights from Johannesburg to Doha. Now, they've said that this is probably going to be for them to be able to put the 4Z code onto Qatar Airways flights. As I mentioned, this is likely because of market access and BSP and behind markets, and Mauritius could be one of those targets. So to be able to sell tickets in Mauritius under the 4Z code to the QR network rather than have to sell it through the QR code. And Mauritius is an interesting market. They claim to be open. They're completely open to people like Emirates who come in with multiple A380s a day, but then you have people like Ethiopian and Qatar who have simply not been able to enter that market despite wanting to. I won't pretend to understand Mauritius politics. It's way above my ethnic and commercial and whatever understandings because there's so many variables there. But I think I wouldn't be surprised to see that in there.
Okay, so we're going to move on now to West Africa and Air Cote d'Ivoire. So this is actually a route suspension. So they've announced that they're suspending routes to Casablanca and Johannesburg, and they've cited operational constraints. So can you enlighten us to this, Behramjee, as to what you understand operational constraints to mean?
I think that's just diplomatic language coming out of Air Cote d'Ivoire in Abidjan. With regards to Casablanca, I know more about that route as to why this has happened. Firstly, Air Cote d'Ivoire have no one but themselves to blame on messing up Casablanca. Why? Because they announced the route 4 times over the last 3 years for it to be launched, and all 4 times it got pushed back. I know because when I was at Air Senegal, I was closely monitoring it because they would be a big competitor to Air Senegal. We used to get 30 to 45 passengers per flight from Casablanca to Abidjan via Dakar, sometimes even more than 50 in high season. So I was closely monitoring the Air Cote d'Ivoire developments on the Casablanca route. Then when they started Casablanca, they made the silly mistake of having a split schedule, twice a week in the morning, twice a week in the afternoon or evening, whereby their network was only getting connected twice a week properly in both directions. whereas the other times it would be just focusing on point to point. And Royal Air Maroc are quite aggressive. They're not just they will not just stand back and let someone cash in. They immediately increased their flights to 12 weekly into Abidjan to send a clear message to Air Cote, we mean business and take us seriously. And unfortunately, due to the better brand reputation and reliability that Royal Air Maroc has, plus the feed beyond Casablanca to Europe and US that they can rely on, they basically ate Air Cote for lunch on that route. Air Cote did have potential on the route because the point-to-point market between Casablanca and Abidjan is nearly 80,000 passengers. And Air Cote has a very loyal following with the Abidjan-based travel agents, but they messed it up royally, commercially and operationally. Now, when it comes to Johannesburg via Kinshasa, the wrong type of aircraft was used, number one. Number two, it was via Kinshasa, not non-stop, but that's obvious because the aircraft could not fly non-stop. But also what I've noticed is that with both Johannesburg and Casablanca, it is out of their comfort zone. It is out of that West Africa, Central Africa comfort zone that Air Cote knows how to sell very well.
Yeah.
And that I feel will be their downfall in also Beirut. Paris maybe not so much because the volume is there and it can sustain itself. But when it comes to Beirut, this will be their downfall as well. They do not yet understand how to sell their flights out of that comfort zone of West Africa and Central Africa. So they need probably a new commercial management sales team to understand how to sell these markets, and they probably need to hire some expats also to help them navigate through this new phase of growth. But Johannesburg was always going to lose money from the get-go, flying via Kinshasa, using an A320, which then got downgraded to an A319 twice a week. That's not a commercially viable schedule at all. So,
Not just twice a week. If you look at the actual schedule into Johannesburg, that plane arrived at 3 in the morning and left at 4:30 a.m. It was a horrendously poor schedule. Unfortunately, for better or for worse, that is right about the time that I am used to arriving into Johannesburg when I come on the SAA red eye from Lagos or the ET red eye from Addis. So invariably at the transit checkpoint, it was me and a whole bunch of very sleepy Ivoirians having flown overnight on an A319 and grumbling about life in general in French. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And looking at the loads that got off that flight, it was piss poor. And generally, it was pretty horrendous. I would not have wanted to fly on that, especially, and that brings into what I'm going to mention here, when your competition was in South African Airways A330 with flatbed seats and even an economy class product that is so many times above that. And I had a chance to actually discuss this with South African Airways in terms of what they think is going to be the impact of HF's withdrawal from this route. Because I was a huge critic of South African Airways going into the Abidjan route as an extension of Accra before, especially when they were going head-to-head with Air Cote d'Ivoire. I was like, this didn't make sense pre-COVID, it's not going to make sense now. But the interesting point which I've seen, and which has been corroborated by the DDS and MIDT data we've seen, is that while their numbers in terms of volume from Abidjan to Johannesburg are not very high, their actual yields on that route are a lot better than their Accra yields. And I think that is an interesting thing to put together over here, because as the person at SAA said to me, Accra drives the volume, Abidjan drives the yield. And I think there is a truth to that in order to make an overall route viable, and remember, they do have Fifth Freedom rights between Accra and Abidjan as well, although they don't usually have a huge following on that is dominated by Emirates and Air Cote d'Ivoire primarily. But when you look at it from that perspective, and I don't have access to their detailed numbers, but in terms of the logic that they're expressing over here is that we can fill that plane from Accra, but we can make money in the front cabin from Abidjan. And I think that's a very important reason why SAA is flying this. I've argued this with them pre-COVID. I've argued them now. Pre-COVID, Africa World Airlines, the goal with SA was to pull out of the Abidjan route and then to code-share with us at AWA. So as I said, I've argued this from the other perspective, but I do understand why they've come back into that market now and why they need to keep that tag running. And with SA and Abidjan in particular, one thing SA has said very clearly is they're getting 2 more A330s this year. One of them, in all likelihood, is going to go on Johannesburg, Mumbai, but that's a whole other discussion for another day out there. And the other one is going to be used to increase frequencies to Lagos and Accra up to daily on both of those. So currently they're at 4 times a week each, and this would allow that extra aircraft would allow them to fill in the gaps and become daily on each. And it will be interesting to see if those new flights will also have tags to Abidjan, or whether they're going to keep that Abidjan at 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. My guess is they'll probably keep the Abidjan tags, maybe switch the days up. But I think they are... Air Cote d'Ivoire's withdrawal from that route has made SAA's presence on that route a lot more viable and a lot more logical today, even though I disagreed with it when it was launched 2 years ago.
The market demand is reasonable, 21,856 passengers, and the yield is about 14 cents miles.
The yield is the key, and that's the thing. 21,000 passengers is not enough for an A330 plus an A320 flying 6 times a week between them. That is just way too much capacity. But when you've only got the A330, which is tagged to Accra, which obviously is an incremental cost, even though the incremental cost, it's a complex operational structure they have, but because of way crew layover and everything. But that incremental tag, and with the higher yield that gives relative to Accra, which I think is in the 8 or 9 cent yield range, we're talking almost double the yield, even though the volume is smaller. That really makes the front cabin more viable as well for the long haul sector. And knowing that AFDB is headquartered over there, there's a chunk, 40 to 60 passengers a month from AFTB in business class coming to Abidjan, from Abidjan to Joburg. I think that's probably going to be a big driving factor for why the route is there. Plus, the politicians love having it. When you've got to go visit AFTB and you've got a flatbed all the way, nothing like it.
Yeah. And
all right. SA is fundamentally still a state-owned airline.
Absolutely. Okay, let's stay in West Africa and let's talk about our friends at Air Peace. So Air Peace
Okay, your friends, John, your friends.
No, they let me down this year, I'm afraid, with attending AviaDev last minute, but we'll forgive them for that. They have operated from Lagos to London Gatwick since March 2024, right at the end of March. And now they have secured slots for 4 flights a week to Heathrow from Abuja, starting 26th of October 2025. Where I want to start on this is actually the role that the Minister of Aviation played in this, because he was very much front and center. I think you have a very big opinion on this, Sean, that it isn't...
Do we want to keep this simple? What's the role the Minister of Aviation played into it? 0. Next question.
Okay.
And let's be very clear over here. Let's be very clear over here. The UK slot allocation process is not driven by governments. Not by the UK government, not by the government of Nigeria, and definitively not by His Excellency Festus Keyamo, Minister of Aviation. So despite the claims of his sycophants, and I've been tangling with a couple of his special advisors on LinkedIn who basically think that the sun doesn't rise unless Keyamo says that it is time for the sun to rise in the west today, for all I care. But no, that is not the case. The reality is Air Peace was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And the reason for this is that there's a very transparent slot allocation process for UK airports. In fact, for most airports around the world, but let's look at the UK in particular. And that is, when slots are available in the general allocation pool, those slots must first be offered in proportion to new entrants. So a new entrant carrier is a carrier who has below a certain threshold of slots and who has applied for those slots at that airport. Air Peace was very lucky that they had applied for the slots at Heathrow, and Iran Air, because of EU sanctions and UK sanctions against Iran, is no longer able to operate to Heathrow. So consequently, 132 seasonal slots, which translates to 3 times a week slots, which Iran Air had, became available. And lo and behold, coincidentally, those exact 132 slots were allocated to a new entrant carrier, which just happened to be Air Peace. Now, the reality is, unfortunately, there were other airlines which could have also gotten these slots. If Uganda Airlines had applied for Heathrow slots, they may have gotten them instead. If United Nigeria Airlines had applied, they may have gotten them. Any airline which is not operating to Heathrow at a certain threshold and had applied this summer for the winter schedule, could have received those slots, but most of them did not. If you look at the slot filings for Heathrow, Uganda Airlines did not apply for slots at Heathrow because they were happy with Gatwick. I know that a lot of African airlines did not apply for Heathrow because they simply did not expect these slots would be in the pool. But they were in the pool, and Airpeace literally was in the right place at the right time. Now, whether they can make a success out of it with Abuja to Heathrow, I'll tell you, my gut feeling on this is no. Abuja is no Lagos. While Lagos market was constantly spilling traffic to indirect carriers because there was insufficient non-stop capacity between Lagos and London, Abuja is the opposite. Abuja is a much smaller market. It's about 1/5 the size of the Lagos market to London, and it is already served by a British Airways 777 daily. I do not think that they will be able to support a 3 times a week 777, which is what they're talking about, between Abuja and London, with minimal connectivity and a god-awful schedule. Because if these are the Iran Air flights, these are going to be arriving at lunchtime into London, and that means its return is going to get back into Abuja at like 1 or 2 in the morning. So these are not going to be good for connectivity or anything else. It's a gateway into Heathrow, which obviously is a positive. If it was up to me, I would actually switch 3 Lagoses into there. And if I were determined to go into Abuja, I would have looked at Abuja to Gatwick. It's all about prestige. You make a lot more friends in Nigerian politics by flying Abuja to London Heathrow than you do by Abuja to Gatwick and just chasing the money. And as we know, Airpeace is not run as a commercial entity. It's run as I have no clue what it's run as.
Okay, so a little bit of credit because they did apply for the slots. They bought a ticket for the draw, and you've explained the slot allocation system. And I would imagine some of those other airlines you talked about maybe are kicking themselves, thinking we should have done it because the world is turbulent.
At least two have quote from at least 2 airlines in Africa have been, oh shit. When they asked, literally the question was, how did Airpeace get it? And I showed them the slot report and showed where that is, and they're like, oh shit. So yeah, I think that sums it up. You can bleep that out if you need to, but I think we're probably okay.
I think we're okay. I'm not going to put an explicit rating on this one. Behramjee, your thoughts on this? Because Sean's kind of touched on the numbers, but we've talked about these routes.
Yes, but Sean did mention one thing which is very important and scary for Airpeace as well as for airline network planners worldwide. Firstly, let's get into the numbers. The Abuja to London market last year was 144,000 passengers, to which 136 went to Heathrow and 8,000 went to Gatwick. The yields are very high. The average fare is over $920 one way. And that's because of the high occupancy of J class and F class on the British Airways flight, which operates on a daily basis. The Airpeace entering Abuja Heathrow is purely a status symbol move, but again, in typical Airpeace fashion, as per their announcement 2 weeks ago or last week, it has no commercial logic because it is 3 times a week Heathrow plus 4 times a week Gatwick. Airpeace does not have the capability from an operational, financial and commercial standpoint to manage a Heathrow and Gatwick of a service to and from Abuja under any circumstances. They are going to mess it up royally, just like how they've done with Bombay, Mumbai, Tel Aviv, Johannesburg, etc. And it just creates an unnecessary complexity. You stick to one airport. You know, just because you want to fly daily from Abuja to London doesn't mean you have to fly to 2 different airports. Yes, getting extra slots was a big achievement for them. Kudos to that. But doesn't mean you have to fly to Gatwick also. As Sean correctly said, you rather exchange those Heathrow slots for Lagos and let Abuja fly exclusively to Gatwick. But the politicians are not like that. For them, Heathrow is the be-all, end-all. So I don't see any positivity out of this except for the fact that they got to fly to Heathrow with slots obtained through the ACL slot allocation process. Apart from that, it's going to be a very painful lesson for them to learn. And also, the only good thing about Abuja is that unlike Lagos, domestic transfer passengers don't have to change airports to connect to domestic Nigerian cities.
But Behramjee, when you arrive at 2 o'clock in the morning, there is no positive about domestic transfer passengers.
I don't know the Gatwick slots as yet. I don't know what timing those are. But let's just say
He's got the morning slots for Heathrow right now. Sorry, the morning slots for Gatwick right now. So Gatwick is not a problem as long as you're not looking at arriving at 5 o'clock in the morning. You can get your slots at any time of day for the most part. There is enough turnover at Gatwick that there is flexibility in timings if you're ready to play with them. And we've seen Uganda slots. They're not the perfect timelines, but they're the general time of day that they are
What I'm just trying to
happy
say
to
is
work
if
with.
they flew Abuja to London, be it Gatwick or Heathrow, using the old Arik Air timing, which means arriving to Gatwick at 7 o'clock in the evening and departing back at 10 o'clock in the night, which means you depart Abuja at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon and arrive back by 5 in the morning. That allows excellent domestic connectivity to Nigeria via Abuja, which unfortunately they don't have right now. That is the only thing I can advise them to look at. But as of right now,
Behramjee, even your team at Arik were not stupid enough to put a 777 worth of capacity into that market.
We did. Yes,
Leave
we did
him
a
alone.
330-200.
I'm giving him credit. I'm saying he wasn't stupid enough to do that.
That's a backhanded compliment. I wouldn't say that was credit.
Yeah, but we had the Kingfisher cabin configuration for that route.
Go on, push back, Behramjee. What are you going to say to him?
No.
He has no defense. He knows
but we had the horrible A340-500 on that route, if you remember. They had it flying it for 4 years.
Yeah. Which is still sitting at Lagos Airport, rotting away in the graveyard.
Nobody has second.
But more importantly, what's the pizza like in Abuja?
I've never had the pizza in Abuja.
Behramjee, in Abuja, there's this wonderful place. This pizza is really good, but it's all halal. They don't give you the proper pepperoni and things on it. So you just have to try it in Abuja.
I've actually never had good pizza in Nigeria, even in Lagos. But I've had good Indian food in Lagos.
You don't say.
Yeah. Well, finally, he's found a country where it's not known for its pizza. I don't think too many are traveling there for pizza.
But I think as a summary, just simply to put in the numbers perspective, 140,000 passengers a year, Abuja to Lagos, Abuja to London, 104,000 of those are already on British Airways, who are flying daily at decent timings, as well as an onward connection, a great premium product. How much of that is Airpeace actually going to be able to steal with this inferior product, an inferior frequency, and an inferior schedule? I do not see how they can realistically expect to make money out of this, because with the 3-time-a-week schedule on that over there competing against the daily, they would, again, leave aside that it's Airpeace, but just looking in terms of the number and capacity share and schedule share, they should be looking at about a 30% market share, which means 42,000 passengers a year. 42,000 passengers a year is not enough to fill up 3 large 777s a week in that market. So I think this is, when you look at it purely from a numbers standpoint, they are not going to be able to make this work. I think they need to be focused more in terms of onboard connectivity, which they do really badly in the first place. They can't play a children's Connect 4 game, let alone connect passengers across their hub. But this is... Last year, I had said that it's going to take a special effort for Airpeace to mess up their operations in the UK market. They are making that effort now.
Quick question. Would the politicians be under pressure to use Airpeace and move away from BA when it's available? Would that be a factor here that they'd say, hey, support a Nigerian carrier? Or are they going to say...
They will pay lip service. They will pay lip service to that. And the minister will say that, absolutely, we must all fly that. And then he'll make sure that he has a tag segment from Edinburgh to London or something and say, oh, but Airpeace could not fly me from that one sector for Edinburgh. And they'll find an excuse for it. So lip service, nothing more.
There's one thing I would like to say for our listeners. I attended a very elite corporate party in Lagos in 2014 when I was at Arik Air. By that time, Arik was well established on the London route, as was Virgin. And one very high net worth individual explained the London route to me in a very simple manner. He said, if you're a king in Nigeria and if you want to be recognized, you will say that you flew British Airways to London. If you want to be classified as a prince, you would fly and say that you flew on Virgin Atlantic. If you just want to be considered as a noble person, you will fly Arik Air. Airpeace has replaced Arik Air as the noble person. The cream of society
You're absolutely right,
He said the
Behramjee.
cream of society will still fly British Airways.
And I will give you another anecdote on this. A similar anecdote from the Ghana side. And many years ago, the president of Ghana was making a state visit to the UK. And the interesting part was that the Ghanaian delegation flew on British Airways, while the British High Commission delegation from Ghana flew with Ghana International Airlines. And so I had a chance to sit down with the High Commissioner, and I was like, why have you chosen to fly with us? And he's honestly, when I fly on British Airways, I'm just seen as some high commissioner to a tin pot little African country. However, when I fly on your airline, I am the British High Commissioner to Ghana. So absolutely, given a choice, I will fly with you and not on British Airways. And I think that sums it up as well. People within the country do not necessarily appreciate what others outside consider as VIPs. So you may actually see the British flying on Airpeace because Airpeace will give them the upgrades and the VVIP treatment and everything else, while the Nigerians simply don't want to be seen flying Airpeace because it's not status symbol enough.
And also,
Fascinating,
lastly,
isn't it?
what Sean and I alluded earlier, Airpeace has to find the financial means to support a double daily London operation, especially in low season. That's going to be a monumental task.
Jairamji, I have many years ago, given up trying to put any financial sense to a lot of decisions Airpeace takes. So there has been very opaque allusions to their financing other than what is in U.S. Department of Justice filings in United States versus Alan Onyema on charges of fraud and money laundering, which is probably the closest anyone has seen any sort of accountability for their financing sources. And yeah, we'll just leave it until something is proven in court, because for now those are just allegations.
Alan, in a TV interview last year when London was launched, he officially admitted that he's paying 29% interest on his bank loan. He said that.
Imagine
29% in Naira is not a big number. 29% in Naira terms, considering how much the Naira has crashed over the last year, you've actually made money.
Yeah. Let's move on. We've got 4 more topics and about 10 minutes.
But they're short.
Sean has to go and make tea.
Kenya,
okay. Yeah. So we're gonna rattle through these. So the first one is really interesting because it's Zambia Airways launching Lusaka Harare in June. We said this might happen. It matches FastJet's early morning schedule, but on different days of the week. So tell us, what have they done, Sean, and why have they done it?
We covered FastJet's launch of Lusaka Harare a couple of months ago when it was first announced, and we had speculated, which was subsequently confirmed by Julian at FastJet, that FastJet is a very crowded market. There are a lot of players in that market, but a lot of those all of the players are Fifth Freedom operators, and they all operate later in the day. FastJet was targeting the morning traffic, and Julian pretty much confirmed that to us. And sure enough, we have seen FastJet is flying Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and now we've seen Zambia Airways launch Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Once pretty much matching the FastJet timings, early morning 6 and 7 a.m. departures, Lusaka Harare. So I think Monday, Wednesday, Friday is a better schedule than Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday if you're going to have a 3 times a week on a business targeted route with 7 a.m. departures. But I also wouldn't want to go head to head with 2 aircraft flying that route that way. So I think FastJet is benefiting from the first mover advantage in this case, and Zambia Airways is playing catch up. But Zambia Airways has a larger aircraft, so if things are going to get more successful with a 737. Sorry, they've got a Dash 8 and a 737, both of which are larger than FastJet's 50-seater E145. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but I think it's very good to see that local carriers are beginning to compete in markets where traditionally it's the Qatars and the Emirates and the Ethiopians and everybody and their dog who flies Lusaka Harare with their freedom traffic rights. But if you find your niche, you find your good schedule, you find your good pricing, you find your loyal clientele, even a small carrier can be profitable head-to-head against the big guys.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next one. If you've got anything to add on that, Behramjee, we're going to talk about ITA or ITA, as they're called, now part of the Lufthansa family of airlines and looking to expand its African network. They've talked about the A321neos being deployed to Lagos and Abidjan, but also perhaps some winter sun flights to Zanzibar. Of course, the Lufthansa team were in Zanzibar for AviaDev as well. So I think this is one for you, Behramjee. You think about their strategy and what's going on with the Lufthansa group?
We discussed potential new opportunities with the A321s for ITA a few months ago, and it looks like they're being lead towards that. Lagos is a natural fit to their network out of Rome due to the high volume of traffic from Italy to Nigeria. So that's a no-brainer in a low-risk manner using A321neo. Zanzibar is also a no-brainer for them on a winter seasonal basis. It's not justified flying it in the summer. But Abidjan, on the other hand, that caught my eye because the demand from Abidjan is not so high for Rome to begin with, and even for Italy in general. The demand for Rome is only 9,783 passengers, while for Milan it is 16,547 passengers, which means that their Abidjan flight will be heavily reliant on onward connectivity via Rome, especially to France and the US and Montreal, Canada, Toronto, etc., whenever Montreal gets launched. When it comes to Abidjan, that will be a very high risk. And if they cannot make Dakar work, which they've officially stated in a network dossier report recently released, that Dakar is not performing as well as it should be, then Abidjan has no chance whatsoever. So I would recommend that they do not look at launching Abidjan. They should just focus on Lagos and Zanzibar for the time being, and maybe instead also look at doing Mombasa in the winter season as well. Because Mombasa historically has high demand from Italy in the winter season, as we all know, through flights operated by Neos and other airlines in the past. So I don't know how Accra is.
Yeah, I was amazed.
Sorry, what?
I was going to say I was amazed by the amount of Italians in Zanzibar. We had Mr. Lamborghini was the guest of honor on the VIP dinner, and there is a lot of Italian investment, Italian tourism, Italians living on that island. Same in Mombasa too, right?
So I would say just forget about Abidjan. Focus where you have already a stable market base to support the flight. So yeah, Lagos, Zanzibar, and Mombasa. Lagos year-round, 4 times a week, and the East African cities winter seasonal 3 times a week each. How is Accra performing, Sean?
Excellent.
By any chance?
Behramjee, what I'm going to say here, it is performing to expectations. I met with the country manager last week when I was there, actually, and had a long chat with her on it, and they're quite pleased with Accra. She's in charge of both Ghana and Senegal, and you know her as well. Hi, Chloe. So yeah, Ghana is doing better than Senegal, at least in that respect, and she's based in Accra. But yeah, one thing I will say is that we do know that when Behramjee gave his entire African route network proposal for ITA, that did get noticed at ITA headquarters. I would not be surprised to say that a lot of the thoughts which they're voicing now at least had some genesis or reinforcement from listening to this podcast, because the people in the corridors of power do listen to us. Whether they take us seriously or not varies from airline to airline, but in this case they seem to have reinforced what Behramjee's ideas were for ITA's potential network in Africa.
I have absolutely no idea after listening to today why they wouldn't take us seriously. Have numerous impressions, silly hats, and other things, but that's the whole point. We're trying to make this informative and entertaining.
We're trying to make African Airlines great again. We're making them great, the greatest.
And all the impressions come from one of our protagonists, so that's good. Let's stick with you, Sean. Let me stick with you. Yeah. We're going to do Africa World Airlines. So today was the Ouagadougou flights. Yep. I think we've covered this, but I think what's interesting is, are we going to see some more growth in the region with these ERJ 145 type size aircraft?
I think they need to. I think the 145 is quickly being left behind as the correct 50-seat gauge in the Ghana domestic and the trunk markets like Lagos, which they're currently competing in. If they want to leverage the 145 strengths, they need to do so by deploying them in markets like the Sahel, Ouagadougou, potentially Niamey, Bamako, stuff like that. These are markets that have chosen to isolate themselves from the Western world. Accra is in that happy position of being friends both with them, with the Western world politically, as well as with this Sahel grouping of states politically. And I think that just gives the advantage of Ghana to be a good intermediary for trade, intermediary for transport, intermediary for a lot of reasons to make it work. And also, and this is an important point, remember that AWA's shareholders are Chinese, and China sees a lot of strategic value in being friendly with the Sahel region. I think on all fronts, there is a good alignment for AWA to double down on the Sahelian routes. And having talked to the AWA people last week in terms of how the pre-sales and all were doing for Wagga, I'll tell you, today's flight was sold out. The inaugural was sold out in both directions as of yesterday. So granted, a lot of that is VIPs and so forth, but the pre-sales have actually exceeded expectations. They did postpone the route launch from the 8th of June to 1st of July, but I expect that this route will be successful in the long run.
All right, fantastic. Anything to add, Behramjee, or should we get on to the
No,
last
I've
topic?
got some important stats to give. Nobody flies currently direct. Pre-COVID, it in 2019 was 24,559 passengers point to point. So for a 50-seater aircraft, that's an ideal target market size to grow. With regards to other potential routes in that Sahel region, Bamako is another no-brainer. It had 12,500 passengers in 2019, and both flights are below 2 hours flying time from Accra, and very good yield as well. A lot of the imports from both countries come from Ghana as well, from Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Senegal. So I would definitely say operating 3 times a week to both cities would be in their best interest long term. And I would say they should do well in those. Niamey is quite small though. Niamey is only 6,000 passengers to from Accra, so not something to worry about. Bamako and Ouagadougou.
You can do Niamey as a
Yes,
triangle
yes,
with Wagga.
yes.
You can do Niamey as a triangle
as
with
a low
Wagga,
risk.
increase frequencies, and fit freedom between Niamey and Wagga is very strong. Very
Yes,
low
as a
risk
low
entry
risk,
strategy.
correct. So that could also be utility flying, as Sean likes to always say. But yeah, I would say it's a no-brainer using that sized aircraft for those markets.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, there is no current connection. There's no current direct flight between Wagga and Nigeria. And so these AWA flights are actually currently timed to connect. Same aircraft should actually be doing it, but they can swap it in Accra to go from Lagos, Accra, Wagga, Lagos, Wagga, Accra, Lagos. So it is designed to provide that feed because that market currently is left with primarily ASky to capture. It's not a huge market. It's smaller than the Accra to Wagga market, but that just is somewhere that
But
has an
Sean,
advantage
one
as
thing
well.
which I know for a fact, the Sahel Nigeria market is more Abuja centric, not Lagos centric. Yeah,
It is. But there is
correct.
no connectivity to Abuja either. And if AWA goes back to what we used to have pre-COVID with the morning-evening Abuja split, that is the ability potentially for AWA to capture that as well. AWA has a blueprint. They just have to pull it out of cold storage, dust off the cobwebs, and make it work, because we've made all these plans already. Andy and Co, just have a look at the archives from 2019, 2020. It's all there. You have my number. Call me.
Very reasonable rates as well. Okay, so let's move to the very last section here, which is all about Air Tanzania. Sean did get some responses to one of the questions that he posed most recently about the one way. But just to refresh everybody's memory, we're going to listen back to what Sean said on the previous podcast. And for those watching, you can watch the reactions of the guys. Here we go.
Air Tanzania have announced flights from Johannesburg to Zanzibar. They have not announced flights from Zanzibar back to Johannesburg. I cannot for the life of me understand how Air Tanzania keeps doing this. What goes up must come down. This is a basic fundamental law of physics, of nature, of airline planning, of anything. But they've done this with Dubai. They're going to do it again with Zanzibar. You can fly nonstop, Johannesburg to Zanzibar. What a wonderful thing. How do I get back? On some days of the week, you need to fly at 10:30 p.m., land in Dar es Salaam at 11, stay the night at the airport or pay your own hotel, and then fly out the next morning at 10 a.m. to get back to Johannesburg. Why would anyone in their right mind choose to do something like this? Why do they not just simply say, all right, I want to serve Zanzibar? And you know what? For an airline that's based in Tanzania, they have failed to exploit Zanzibar non-stop and holiday capability woefully. Their only long-haul route from Zanzibar is to Gwangju. That also is just one way. Because this fixation of one-way flights is just asinine. Forget everything else I've said about Air Tanzania. Please, somebody from Air Tanzania, you know how to contact me. You're going to be at AviaDev. Come and tell me why you're doing this, because I have racked my brains. I have pulled out hair. I have asked everybody I know in this industry, why could they be doing it? And everybody's just, I don't know, they're Air Tanzania.
So at least we know where your hair's gone now, Sean.
I will say one thing, and I'm going to give a huge props here to Peter Olanga, the CEO of Air Tanzania, who I did have a chance to speak with at AviaDev, and he did give me the answer to exactly this question. So when I said somebody from Air Tanzania, please come and tell me, their CEO actually did. So thank you very much. The reason, according to him, is that they are short on crew at this point of time, and that by doing a 4-sector pattern with crews based in Dar es Salaam, so Dar es Salaam, Zanzibar, Johannesburg, Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, that would require an additional set of crew, which quite simply they do not have at this point of time, enough crews to be able to operate that. So by doing this as a triangle route on a temporary basis, he assures me that at least allows them to enter the market and push connections via Dar es Salaam rather than have to use additional crews. So it's still a suboptimal situation, but at least the suboptimal situation that is driven by a constraint and not just driven by a lack of understanding of which side of the plane points up. So credit to Air Tanzania where credit is due. That's one of the few places I'll give them credit. But thank you very much to Peter Olanga. A lot of credit to you and to Patrick, the commercial director, both of which were very open and spoke to me very openly about Air Tanzania, their plans and so forth, despite my vociferous criticisms of them in the past.
But I would say with that, Sean, there is a new regime, right? It's new people, both. It's not even the Patrick that was there. It's a different Patrick for those listening. And obviously, Peter's been in place since November, December time. I thought he was excellent on the CEO panel. All of the sessions from AviaDev are available as podcasts. All the panels anyway, because some of the presentations don't make sense as podcasts, but all of the presentations and every single session is available on the AviaDev YouTube channel. There's all of that information out there, and I thought Peter did it.
Like and subscribe.
And subscribe. I like it. I like it. So we've hit nearly an hour, 40 minutes, something like that. When we edit this, it might be like 20 minutes or something, but no, that's the full recording. Thanks to you guys for doing all the work that you do every single month. Of course, I'm sure everybody listening is already connected, but I'll put the links in there so you can follow Behramjee and Sean. Our stage show will take to the road at some point. If there is sufficient demand, who knows, we might do a podcast live one day if we can all be on the same continent, because we're all on different continents right now. But yeah, it's great to have you guys with us. And thank you to all the listeners that I know look forward to it. And I think we got plenty of feedback, didn't we, Sean, at AviaDev as well, of people we know in the industry are listening.
I genuinely was shocked. I was shocked as to how many random, well, I wouldn't say random, I mean, there are obviously people who know us, but how many people approached me out of the blue and were like, I love your podcast. And where is Behramjee was probably the most common question out there, because I think there were a lot of people who showed up there wanting to get Behramjee autographs or pizza recommendations or whatever else. So a huge thank you to all our listeners. You guys are the reason we keep doing this every month. It's partly also because I enjoy venting, and Behramjee enjoys breaking out his spreadsheets to an audience that doesn't fall asleep. But I think from our perspective, Jon does this twice a week anyway. So he's the pro at the podcasting, but I know it's really great to listen to you guys. And I know there are a number of people who listen to this podcast who also don't like us. And one in particular has unfriended me on LinkedIn this week. So here's a hi to you, even though you can no longer see my posts. And yeah, it's great to have you guys tuning in.
Yeah, I think we get such amazing feedback from really high up people with loads of experience,
mostly
who are saying who keep saying to me, do you know what, keep doing it, because it's unique and it's offering something you don't get somewhere else, and it's not a press release. It is something where there is actual conjecture. And just like the example we had with Air Tanzania, you ask the question, you get the answer. You've had a fair debate. You've never backed down from a debate. If somebody wants to disagree, get them on the podcast, get the boxing gloves out, and let's do it. I'm very happy to do that. So the gauntlet is there for any of these people that maybe disagree with you, Sean, to come on and let's get a debate going. But thanks to you guys, it's been great fun as well doing this for the last couple of years. We're almost probably 2 years old this year, aren't we? So it's been a labor of love, and obviously editing it and adding in all of the maps to Behramjee's favorite pizza restaurants and whatever else there is. Favorite topping, Behramjee, before we go? What's your favorite topping on a pizza? Pineapple.
Yeah,
this is why you.
No.
It could have only been worse if he'd said smoked salmon.
Oh, please. Oh, God, no. I think we better end this now, John, please.
I agree.
No, please. I've got to go throw up. Go throw up.
Don't throw up. You've got to make dinner. So, no, thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for sticking with us all this time. Thanks to you guys. And we will be back for the next one next month. All right. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.